Hey guys, today I have a couple General's guns that I want to show you, but first let me get a couple housekeeping things out of the way. First, before the end of January 2022, make sure you vote for the Gungees Award, the Ganges, the Undies, the Gundies. Here's a link. You can go to the Gundies and vote for Legacy Collectibles for their gun reviewer category. We would really appreciate it. You can vote up to, well, vote early and often, but check it out. Make sure you continue voting through the end of January. Secondly, don't forget we're going to be at the Show of Shows in Louisville at the end of February. Just email us. Here's our email. Email us if you're interested in our reception. We're going to have a VIP reception where we're going to have food, drink, meet the staff, come by and say hi to me, but also, and most importantly, I'm going to have some of your favorite guns, the guns that you saw in our videos, some of the ones out of my personal collection. We'll bring them there. You can put on your gloves and pick them up and get your picture taken with them. So make sure you check it out. Consider coming to the SOS show. And if you're there, by all means, come to our party on Friday night. Okay, now going back in review, actually right around the time of the holidays and before I got COVID, I did a video about a general officer's pistol that was issued to General Sherburne. And I promised you I had a couple more, especially one that was issued to a mobster, famous mobster, and some of you said, whatever happened to that? Well, we're finally getting back on track and wanted to follow up on that promise. So I have two pistols that I want to show you, but first, in way of a review, do you remember the video where I talked about General Sherburne? And he was my kind of general. He was kind of a man's man out in front, leading his troops. And that's one of the reasons that, I'm sure that's one of the reasons his pistol sold almost immediately. He was in the 101st Airborne. He parachuted into Normandy behind enemy lines and led his troops out in front. Also, he was involved in Operation Market Garden. Some of you know that was the movie A Bridge Too Far. At that time, he came in on a glider and again fought with his troops. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, the artillery, field artillery commander, and he helped lead the defense of Bastogne. So this guy was a real fighting general. But I also, in researching that, I realized there were a lot of generals. There's logistical generals and administrative generals and fighting generals, all very important, but all of them had the opportunity to pick up some officers' pistols, which I want to share with you. Just as a comparison, I looked up how many generals, U.S. Army generals, served in World War I, and the answer is 375 generals. Now, World War II, there were about 1,100 U.S. Army generals. And compare that with today, there were about 230 generals. Now, there are also U.S. Marine Corps generals and Air Force generals, and so there are other generals, but just for the sake of comparison, about 230 today compared to 1,100 in World War II. So moving on to two new generals, I'm going to talk, in this video, I want to talk about these two officers' pistols. Both of these are model 1903s, and I think I mentioned before in the previous video, they also made a 1908, which is exactly the same, except it is in 380. Some of you corrected me, I said 38 caliber. It's not. It is 380, and this is 32 caliber. So this is the 03. They made a lot more of the 03 than the 08. This also, both of these, and also the Sherburne pistol, they were all Parkerized finished. Almost all of them went back to Rock Island and were reparked, and that's the condition we see these in today. Now, while most of these guns were made in the late 40s, 42 to up about 45, they actually weren't issued because they had a good idea that the generals would want them, but in fact the generals tended to keep their 1911 Colts that they got earlier, and they carried them on their belt, other than Patton, of course, who carried the Smith & Wesson revolver. But you do see the generals carrying the 1911. But what happened with these is, even though they were made for World War II, they were put on a shelf and stored away, and then many of them came out during Korea, Vietnam, and particularly when the generals would retire. I mentioned that they were given them as a gift. Turns out that some of the military people corrected that as well. They did have to pay for their own guns. which seems kind of ironic in that we now give them to the Taliban. But in that day and age, they had to buy their guns. It was probably only about 25 bucks. But nonetheless, upon retirement, we see Sherburne bought a pistol and kept it until after he died. This pistol, in particular, was issued to Major General Frederick Munson. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, and then this one was the one that went to the mobster. And actually, there's a lot more information about him because of his notorious activities. But this was Brigadier General Charles Barron. The reason I'm pointing here is he actually inscribed his name on his gun. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But let's start off with General Munson. Okay, this is the 1903 Colt, model 1903 Colt. You can see the logo is very clear, the serial number is very clear. But one of the ways you can tell this was re-Parkerized, and again, Rock Island Arsenal did this. You can see the Colt Stallion is somewhat faded, and even more so the cross-cannon cartouche right here. And then, of course, they come with wooden grips and the medallion, the Stallion medallion. And there is the original magazine that is marked for .32 caliber. I'll show you that, but that's what the magazine looks like. It's actually blued. So they didn't bother reparking that. That's the original magazine, original blue. The other side, what's important about these, because they do make, obviously they make a commercial version of this gun. Here's a picture of the commercial one. They are blued finish. They have both the black grip variation, the early ones, and then later they went to the wood grip. But what makes this U.S. Army issued is it's marked U.S. property, and then also the cross-cannon cartouche. But U.S. property, and then all of them will have that same logo. That shows you the .32 caliber. This gun, however, is not matching. The slide and the frame have two different numbers on them. And I did read that that was pretty common because when Rock Island, they took them apart, they lined them up, they put them in the tank or however they parked them. And then when they put them together, they just put them together and didn't bother to double check it. So it often happened that you would get mismatched parts. When that happens, it does reduce the price a little bit, but it still shoots just as smoothly and just as accurately, even though the slide and the frame are not numbered the same. So let's talk a little bit about General Munson, because obviously I wanted to research him a little bit. And what was fascinating about him is I actually found it very hard to get any information on him, and I never did find a picture of him. If any of you have a way of getting a picture of General Frederick Munson, please let me know. I know he came from a military family. His father was an officer. I think he was born up in the New York area, or that's where they were in an Army base in upstate New York, but then he moved all over the country, like most Army families. His brother was a general in World War II. He was a general in World War II. Hard to find any information, and I think part of the reason could be he was what we call a spook. If you're outside the United States, you may not understand that reference, but a lot of times secret agents, spies are called spooks because they're in the shadows, kind of ghostly figures, and that's exactly what he was. Let me go over a little bit of his history, and I think you'll get a glimpse of what this man went through and why nobody really knew who he was. Frederick Munson retired as a brigadier general in the late 50s. He also worked at the American College. He taught there, and he died in 1992 of cancer. He was buried in Arlington Cemetery. So he graduated from West Point in 1926. He was commissioned to the infantry, and just like Sherburne, he was transferred to field artillery. However, he was given a special assignment in 1932 to 1936. So before the hostilities started in World War II, he was sent to Japan. And that was not that unusual because actually Japanese attachés came to the United States to learn the art of modern warfare. And we sent generals, or we sent attachés to Japan to learn their style of fighting and their tactics. And that's exactly what he did. He studied the language in Japan, and he learned all about the soldier code in Japan and how it was different, how they were willing to die for their emperor, etc. He learned all of that between 1932 and 36. But then, of course, Japan first invaded northern China going after natural resources, and the war started for them, but not for us. But as a attaché to Japan, he was recalled and sent to Peking. In Peking, he served there under Joseph Stilwell. He was part of the U.S. Embassy, the team there. Stilwell, of course, later became a famous general in World War II for fighting the Japanese. When the Japanese finally took over the capital and actually imprisoned the embassy staff, he was interned by the Japanese until about 1942 when he was repatriated. And that was through a embassy staff exchange between the Japanese and the United States. Of course, with his direct knowledge of Japanese tactics, Japanese language, and even some of the Japanese generals and the way that they thought, he was assigned to Admiral Bill Halsey, of course, famous in naval warfare in the Pacific. So he was an intelligence officer reporting to Bill Halsey. Later, he was promoted and put on staff of General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of all the Allied forces in the Pacific. And again, he was an intelligence officer under General MacArthur. After the war was over, he also served in military intelligence during the Korean War. He actually worked on the staff of the Joint Chiefs and reported directly to Omar Bradley, who is in charge of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's a mouthful, but he was an intelligence officer reporting to Omar Bradley. So all this time he was an intelligence officer. In 1953, he was stationed as an attaché in Paris, and there he was again an intelligence officer working out of the embassy, and most likely at that point was looking into communism and combating communism, which was beginning to spread throughout Europe in the 1950s. So all his life he served as an intelligence officer, reporting to people that we all have heard their names. They got a lot of notoriety, but his name was barely mentioned. And when you Google him, there's not much information at all. So for General Munson and those who serve behind the scenes like he did, thank you for your service. Extremely important. But it's men like that who get no praise and notoriety, but I'm sure he probably saved a lot of lives with the work in intelligence that he did. So let's move on to our next general, who is Brigadier General Charles Barron. Now, he's the one, we'll have to say, he's notorious. And interestingly, as a mob figure, if you Google Charles Barron, you'll get a ton of information about his mischievous deeds, including being charged with murder 2 times. Now, it's kind of interesting because what I read about it said he murdered 2 people. And then he said, then later they said he was acquitted on both counts. Now, I think if you're acquitted, you're not allowed to say he murdered 2 people. He allegedly murdered 2 people. And I want to tread lightly because I actually, when I mentioned his name the first time, I had a grandson or a great-grandson, a relative of his, actually contacted me and said, that was my great-uncle or my great-granddad. But so there is a relative watching this channel, so I want to tiptoe very lightly. Let me tell you at least what I have read on the internet, and he did have a lot of famous friends, so let's talk about that. He was a general, but he started out his career, he was a car dealer in Chicago. Of course, Chicago, which was famous or infamous throughout the world of being the mob capital of the world. Today, it's more famous for other things, not so much corruption, but more the murder capital of the United States. But nonetheless, back then, it was a very corrupt city. And he got involved in a car dealership, was a business leader in Chicago, but also no disparagement of a political party. He got very involved in the Democratic Party. Under the Dailies, it was a very corrupt system, and the mafia was very involved in the politics and the business of Chicago. So car dealership, the war broke out, everybody had to go and serve. He, of course, because of his political connections, was assigned to a post as an officer, later assigned as a general. And from what I could read, very little about his service other than he was working behind the scenes as a logistical person or an administrative person in the U.S. Army. Now, he may have done some very heroic things. I don't know. I didn't read any of that, and so I don't want to disparage his service to our country. I'm sure it was well-intended, well-meaning, and I'm sure he got into it out of love for his country. When the war was over, he came back to Chicago, and he was a brigadier general. He was promoted to brigadier general as a general in the Illinois National Guard. He also went to a lot of the meetings of National Guardsmen throughout the country, and so he made famous friends around the country. Some of his known associates on the mafia side, he was a known associate of Meyer Lansky, which is a name that many of you will recognize, and certainly a name that you will recognize. He was a known associate of Al Capone. Now, just like Al Capone, Charles Barron was a gun collector. He has a number of guns. In fact, if you can take a look here, when I Googled his name, I came up with guns that have been sold in the past, and he made a rookie mistake for a collector. What he did is he engraved his name and the fact that he was a brigadier general on many of his guns. And so you see he collected Smith & Wessons, he had pocket pistols, and he also was given this gun. This gun was given to him by William Henry Harrison. That's right, General Harrison Jr. was issued this gun and gave it to Charles Barron as a gift. Let's take a closer look at this gun. Okay, this will look pretty familiar to you. This was re-Parkerized as well. Not in as good a condition. It looked like it was holstered, or maybe that looks like it was a rub mark, and often they were put under the seat of the car. I had a gun that came in, and it had a big rub mark right there, and the guy said, I kept it in my truck, and that's where it rubbed on the spring. But he's got some unusual wear there. You can see the Parkerized is a little bit more, so much so that you can't really, well, you can barely see the stallion, and I can't see the cartouche at all. But it's a very similar gun. It wasn't held a lot because there's not a lot of wear on the front or back strap. So that's pretty clean, just some wear marks here. And then on the other side, you do see the U.S. property. But glaring on this is this inscription, Brigadier General Charles Barron, and that's his GI number, U.S. Army. He had that inscribed on here, which really hurts the value. I have to joke because I often will get a mint gun, and the guy, somebody will buy it from me, and I'll say, hey, listen, I'm sending that out to you. Thank you so much for your business. And just no extra charge, I went ahead and carved your initials on the slide. I love the reactions. People who know me know I'm joking, but some people have a panic attack. He actually did. Now, how does that affect the price? Well, of course, anytime you carve your initials or your GI number, or I love my mom, or whatever you put on it, it hurts the value dramatically. In this case, because he is a famous or infamous person, it may not hurt it that much because it clearly went to him. Like people say, how do you know it went to him? Well, there it is. He wrote his name, and he did that with other guns that he owned. I mentioned that Al Capone was also a gun collector. I participated recently in an auction that was out in California. In fact, one of our subscribers wrote to me, he's from England, and he said, do you know about this auction? And I didn't, so I went and checked it out. And Al Capone's granddaughter was auctioning off some of her grandfather's possessions, but also her father's. So the son, Sonny Capone, was a big gun collector. He probably had about 20 guns for sale that all had provenance saying that they were in the collection of Sonny Capone. And before that, Al Capone, he only had a couple of guns. He had others that had been auctioned off earlier, but two in particular were Colts. One was a 1903, I think, and it was nickel-plated. It had been pimped out, stag grips and all that. So Al Capone tended to pimp out his guns a little bit, and the estimate was for like $20,000, and in fact, it went more like $300,000. So it went for a lot of money, but that was two guns from Al Capone, and then a lot of guns from Sonny Capone, and Charles Barron was a known associate. Now, there was a couple other known associates that I wanted to mention. One of the ones that was in an article, he was a known associate of Jack Ruby. If you know that name, Jack Ruby was the Chicago mobster that shot Lee Harvey Oswald. And many of you were alive and saw that as it happened live, and that was really a poignant part of our American history. But on the military side, he actually made some friends in the military among the generals. And again, he would go to reunions or he would go to meetings of the commanders of all the National Guardsmen from around the country. He became good friends with Curtis LeMay. They corresponded back and forth. If you don't know that name, his nickname was Bombs Away LeMay, and that's because Curtis LeMay came up with the concept of carpet bombing and basically total destruction of your enemy. And so he was the man behind the whole tactic of carpet bombing both Japan and Germany. Makes him very unpopular with our enemies, but in the United States, he was pretty well known as Bombs Away LeMay. So he was a known associate of his. And one other, there's a letter, and it's sold on eBay. Separate from this gun, there's a letter from William Henry Harrison, and that's who this gun was first issued to. William Henry Harrison, if the name sounds familiar, and by the way, that's Jr., William Henry Harrison Jr., his father was a general and also, I believe, a Medal of Honor winner in World War I. And before that, his father's father was a president of the United States. So William Henry Harrison was a president, and the man who was Harrison that was issued this gun was a direct descendant of a president of the United States. Now, William Harrison was more of a logistical general. He was issued this gun after the war, and he gave it as a gift to Charles Barron. So that's a lot to try to, okay, how did all that happen? How did they meet? We're not sure what the association is, but we were able to find on the internet that eBay sold a letter. If we could put the gun and letter together, there is a letter from Barron, from General Charles Barron, to General Harrison saying, thank you so much for the gift of this pistol. As you know, I have a collection. Thank you for the gift. I really appreciate it. I'll put it as part of my collection. He didn't say, oh, by the way, I'm going to carve my name into it. But it does say they were friends. He said, next time I'm in your area, I'll stop by for a visit. So General Harrison and General Barron were known associates, and for some reason, he gave him this gun. Maybe he knew he was a collector and would appreciate it. But again, the letter is dated 1966. So that's about the time that all of these officers' pistols were issued to officers or gifted to other people. So I guess I could conclude by saying whoever bought that letter off of eBay, get in touch. Let's put the letter and the gun together. That would make a winning combination. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something today. I learn something every time I do these videos. Having a lot of fun. Hope you are too. Don't forget to vote, and don't forget to come to our party.